Well, Matt Deppy asked me to give this talk and talk about, the importance of the international market. I think that it's really well fitting for the situation we're in right now as a cattle industry, both in Iowa and the nation. When we're talking about growth, really that growth of how large the U.S. cattle industry or the Iowa cattle industry can get is really dependent on both domestic and export demand. And so the need for these missions, the need for really nurturing the relationships that we do have for our export market is really important. I had the opportunity to go on one of these trade missions, would have been this last November, and when I came into this job, I understood the importance of really the export market and that it was such a big number. But really understanding why that those relationships have developed, and even when we see impacts of price or supply or demand on the international market, why we can really recapture that market share. It's because of those relationships that we've built up over time. There's very much a trust factor. There's people on the ground with USMEF as well as these trade missions that allow us to really nurture those relationships and maintain the export demand and allow us to really be able to grow the industry and really kind of compete with that vitality of the industry. So a lot of times, or every May, I help put together the May Beef Month here in Iowa, and these are the statistics for Iowa. And I always really like to point to these when we're talking about growth or at least sustaining this industry and how competitive we are in the industry. It's because beef demand is so strong. And we're able to produce at the levels because there's consumers both on the domestic market and export market that really value our product, are willing to pay for our product, even our product at higher prices when we have tighter supplies. And we're really able to maintain the numbers and now even talk about growth. And so when we talk about, we can talk about all the numbers, the inventory sizes. I really like to look at these cash receipts from cattle and calves. And I don't have the slide here, but I look at those cash receipts annually, and cattle is really king. When you compare it to hogs, when you compare it to corn and soybeans, the business that we're really doing here in Iowa. And that is because really, it's a high value product. We're selling that both on the domestic market, on the export market, and really allows us to really maintain those cash receipts. Also, we're supporting jobs both directly and indirectly in Iowa and a major contributor to Iowa's economy. So I want to kind of step back and both talk about demand in the form of domestic demand, but also export demand and how they really work together to really show the demand for beef products. And so when we look at demand, and I find it difficult to talk about demand because we a lot of times look at the quantity that people are consuming. But demand's really critical, but yet it's often really confused. So when we talk about demand strength, it really reflects this consumer's valuation of beef. So it's both how much they're consuming, but also how much they're paying for it. I mean, they could be consuming an infinite amount, they're really not paying anything for it. But it really doesn't say anything about demand for our beef products. So it really shows what the underlying dollar value is available for the industry and drives prices and really profitability for all. So if we look at this last year in 2014, record high cattle prices, record high beef prices. Well, why were cattle prices able to be supportive to really support profitability in the cattle feeding industry especially? Well, we're placing record high placements, but we had the support of prices from live cattle prices because we pushed that on to consumers. Yes, they've consumed less, but they've been willing to pay more for our beef at a little bit lower consumption to really help support prices throughout the whole supply chain. And that's very important at a situation we're in currently. We have very tight supplies, but we have the demand strength that's allowing us to really flourish in the industry currently as we build up supplies, eventually increase supplies, put more supplies on the market really at competitive prices. So I want to draw out an example here to hopefully kind of show you what I'm meaning by demand in the industry. So think about you're shopping for steak or really any product here, and you observe a buy one, get one free sale. Do you ever buy more than just one steak? I think everyone would answer yes, right? My wife gets caught up in this so much. Buy one, get one free, she buys 3 or 4. And then, we're getting one free, but she's also buying multiple sets of that. So let's think about this situation. So the money in your wallet, really the physical characteristics of the steaks, did not change at all. You still spent the same amount on the steak, you just got one additional steak because it was buy one, get one free. So your per capita consumption consumed of that steak or purchased of that steak increased, but because you bought one rather than two. But we didn't see any demand change. Because the only reason you bought two is because you essentially got it at lower prices per pound or per steak, if you think at it in those senses. So per capita consumption, this is part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. This isn't demand. So when we're talking about per capita consumption, we have our domestic production. So that's what you in this room are producing. This is what the cattlemen are producing in the industry. Then we have a small bit of imports that we do bring in here in the U.S. And then we have the big exports. And that exports is important because it's removing part of the domestic production we have that's going on the export market. But also think about if we're reducing our exports, that's putting more on the domestic market. So if we have a very large demand issue on the export front, that may put more supplies on the U.S. market, and that'll decrease prices if demand stays the same. Then we have a small adjustment for cold storage, and then really just divided by population. So in this equation, I don't see anything for prices. So we really don't see the value of that consumption from consumers. So when we talk about beef demand, we're really looking at a schedule of beef quantities consumers would purchase over a range of prices. So as economists talk about, this is really the demand curve that we have. Then we also have the quantity of beef demanded. So this is quantity of beef consumers will purchase at a given price, refers to the point on the demand curve. So I promise I'm only going to show one graph. But this is your typical supply and demand graph here. And so think about quantity one here. So we have a price paid for that. And we've had tighter supplies as of late. And so that's increased prices. So say we're moving from 2013 to 2014. So we're moving from price 1 to price 2. Well, if demand is flat, we're consuming here at this QE level. But what have all economists been trying to tell you? Demand hasn't been flat. Demand's been increasing. We've seen an increase shift in demand. And so our demand curve, importantly, is shifting outward. And so we're really at quantity Q2 there. So we're consuming more at higher prices than we would have anticipated because we've seen an increase in demand. That's very important because even at higher prices, consumers are still quantity demanding our product, which is very important, especially as we're getting tighter and tighter supplies. It shows that once we do build up those supplies, we can get a larger potential reaction in the quantity consumed. So demand index. So if we look at a demand index, this really just shows how that demand curve moves from year to year. So this would be from quarter 1, 2013 to quarter 1, 2014, or 2013 to 2014. And that demand index, it's always relative to a base here, but importantly, it provides no indication for why demand is increasing or decreasing. It really just shows you that something has occurred, that we've seen an increase in demand. So I do a demand index for Iowa State University, and this is the Choice Beef Annual Demand Index going back to 1980. And as you see, we've seen demand decrease. We're really in a long decrease of demand. We did see a little bit increase here, and we'll kind of explain those increases. And now we've actually seen an increase the last several years here. What's important here is look at the two lowest points. So we had demand index of 52 in 1998 and 56 here in 2010. So in those years, if demand would have been as strong as 1980, because we're benchmarking it to 1980, then these real beef prices in those years would have actually doubled, because consumers would have been paying higher and higher prices because we were having increased shift in demand. In fact, it didn't, and so we've seen those low points in demand. So I went and looked at some data from your last two demand studies, and these are from the Cattlemen's Beef Board. They were checkoff funded. And the 2009 study really showed income expenditures have increased in most years. So we have more disposable income as consumers. That can be a demand shifter. Also, we can attribute some of this to some health and nutrition, the Atkins diet. We look at zinc, iron, protein was an increase. Otherwise, some of the health and nutrition have been negative impacts. Convenience overall has been negative impacts. FSIS recalls negative, and relative protein prices are negative impact. And I think this one's really important, especially in really current times. And this is both on, the export and the domestic market. Entering 2014, we really thought beef was going to be in a really relative price disadvantage to pork and poultry, because we were already talking expansion a year ago in all those respective industries. And we know how long it takes for the cattle industry to build up supplies. And so, now we're entering 2015, and we're talking expansion in all those industries again. And those relative prices do matter, especially when we are talking demand, because there is some switching between those relative proteins. So currently, this is the current Q3 demand index. Demand had been very strong, but really it's been a price point that we've seen. So we've seen 17 consecutive years of year-over-year increases. But look, over the last year, we've decreased consumption about 5%. But consumers have paid about 14% higher prices for the beef that they are consuming. And so if price would have only increased about 3-4%, we'd have seen 0% demand change. But in fact, it's been 3-4 times that. So really, we've seen this large demand increase because of the situation of tighter supplies, but willingness of consumers to pay higher and higher prices. And I think if you would have asked most analysts coming into this situation, both on the domestic and export market, would we see demand this strong, continuing the 17th consecutive quarters of year-over-year increase? I think that would have surprised a lot of us, because consumers at some point do start to push back at higher and higher prices. But for the most part so far, we've been able to push those higher prices on to consumers. So we look at that per capita consumption and price standpoint. We see here in 2014, this would be a 0% demand change. We're up here somewhere for where prices are being paid. So 2014, again, is looking to be another increased shift in demand on an annual basis. We've seen it the last 3 quarters from a quarterly basis. So then fast forward a little bit, looking at this 2013 beef board study, looking at several factors here. And this, I give you the website there, and this was done by Ted Schroeder, Glenn Tonzer, and Jim Minard down at Kansas State University. And really the goal here was to identify demand drivers to focus effort on. And now remember, these are domestic factors. Some of these factors would be similar in the export market, and I'll get to those here shortly, but these are domestic factors. So they looked at food safety, product quality, price, nutrition, health, sustainability, and social aspects. And so this is what their research found. And this was surveys both looking from consumers as well as looking into the supply industry from packers and retailers. So here they found the most important to focus on would really be food safety, product quality, and price. And mostly food safety and product quality, because both it's impactful for consumer demand and also it's feasible to be influenced. We can make improvements in food safety and product quality. Remember, price is very impactful. That's typically one of the 1 or 2 or 3 largest points for consumers. But there's only so much you can do as far as price given the supply situation that we have. So while it's very impactful, it's not as feasible to really impact that so much, especially in the short run. We look at secondary here, importance to focus on nutrition and health, and then less important, but what does get the biggest buzzwords? Is this sustainability and social aspects of it. So consumers ranking these, while they're talking very loud in some of the purchasing decisions we see, those are less important to focus on. Not important to focus on though, because they do garner a lot of impact potentially. So let's look at some export demand, because I've talked mostly about domestic. And so I pulled these statistics from USMEF to just show how impressive the beef export market is for the U.S. And we see here in 2013, beef and beef variety meats. What's important there, beef variety meats, a lot that we're not consuming here, are very much demanded on the export market, and it can attract a lot of value for the U.S. That would be essentially put in secondary products here in the U.S. This amounted to about 2.6 billion pounds, worth about $6.2 billion. Top 10 exported beef cuts represent about 85% of the total U.S. beef exports. This one, I think, has increased definitely, right, with higher prices, more value on that export market. Looking at, the beef export value equated to about $245 per head of each steer and heifer processed in 2013. That becomes higher prices. And then here, about 13.2% of U.S. beef and variety meat production was exported in 2013. U.S. is the biggest producer and exporter of beef. I mean, this is a huge market for the U.S. So I wanted to look at really the next 10 years because this is important as we build up beef supplies in the market. What are really the future and export opportunities out there for the U.S.? So over the next 10 years, and this is USDA data, global meat consumption projected to grow about 2%, just under 2%. But beef exports projected to grow even higher at about 2.8%. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a really favorable opportunity for beef exporters. That exports is going to grow faster than consumption. And why is this? Well, it's similar to a lot of the cases that we did see with the domestic cases. Here we're looking at increasing populations, rising per capita consumption, changes in consumer preferences. Like we heard Dean talk about grain-fed. That's becoming a buzzword on the export market, that changing consumer preferences for our export customers. Improvements in product characteristics, convenience, tenderness, food safety, health, nutrition. I think the convenience one is becoming incredibly important when we look at the export market. When I was on a trade mission, really the ability to produce those products how their consumers want them, either presented to them, either taught to them how they can cook those products, is really important to increasing that demand. So again, looking at our USDA projections for the 10 years, this beef cow number, that number is so important when it comes to looking at what our both domestic and export demand is going to be. How high we can push the capacity of increasing the number of beef cows is really how much demand we're going to have both on the domestic and export market. Because we only consume so much on the domestic market. And so it's really that large increase that we can see potentially is from increasing demand from our exports. So if we look at our beef cow inventory here at 29.3 in 2013, USDA is looking at about a 16% increase from our 2014 level. Our domestic beef, red meat and poultry consumption, while expectations are we are going to consume a little bit less beef in the U.S. market over the next 10 years. Some of that we're going to see changing consumer preferences. There's competition against other relative meats, as we're seeing, slight increase potentially in pork, poultry. And these aren't, again, set in stone. I mean, there's a lot that the beef industry is doing that can combat, losing some of that market share to the other relative meats, also increasing per capita consumption. But really, look at these U.S. beef exports. If we're increasing about 39% from 2013 levels, and about 13% of our forecasted production would be on the export market. That's a huge part of that value chain, of that pie, that can be attributed to the export market. So when we talk about these trade missions and why are certain areas targeted, it's because of the importance of their economy, as well as the relationships that we've built up. So I've graphed the average GDP growth and average population growth. So we talk about China a lot. Well, why do we talk about China a lot? Well, when we look at average population, they're trying to control their population. But look at their GDP growth over the next 10 years. If I'm a major exporter, do I want to be exporting to that market? They have a lot of available dollars. So that's why we're seeing, some targeted outreach there as far as from USMEF and other parts of the cattle industry. Japan here, right now we're seeing kind of curtailing their population as well as their GDP. But the thing about Japan is we've developed that market so much over the last several years that's a major export destination for us, and a market that, we shouldn't forget about just because we're not seeing the growth in either population or in GDP growth. So just to kind of summarize some of these developed world changes. So this is the developed world, and then I'll talk about the developing world here in a second. When we look at the developed world, we see declining global economic prevalence, population, per capita meat consumption. So think about Japan there, where we're seeing kind of declining, or at least percentage of the declining population and GDP growth. Similar case for U.S. and Canada. We're seeing about 2.6% increase in GDP. But think about the different dependence on the domestic production for those two countries, for North America, essentially. Japan here, major meat importer currently, but will exporters care less going forward? That was one thing that really stuck in my mind on the meat trade mission was, we had several people blatantly ask the question. Now, we hear all the news about China, the growth in the economy in China, and even some little bit increase in the population. Don't forget about Japan. That really came through hard, that, they really demand our products. They're willing to pay for our products, and, keep this relationship where we've at. They haven't left us with increasing prices or other issues that we've had on the domestic front. So, maintain this market for us. And then Europe, Europe's an interesting case where, they're really the influential thought leader when it comes to, some of the antibiotic use and some of the production practices that maybe are used here in the U.S., and they question some of those practices. And how do they really fit into this export market? As we're seeing more and more consumers care about how their products are produced, do they become maybe a player in some of this market? And then the developing market here, if we look at increasing global population, so really just the flip side of the developed countries, right? So we have Africa, Middle East. Now if we go back to this equation, or to this graph here, look at where Africa is. That's the best of both worlds, right? Increasing population, increasing economic prevalence. But arguably, we know the least about that. We're learning more about that market, but that's a market where we haven't had that knowledge base that we maybe have in some of the more traditional markets. Latin America, where we're seeing some of the more of the free trade agreements targeted or starting to be implemented. They're a growing producer and growing consumer. China, interesting there. Canada has access, but the U.S. doesn't. Vice versa with South Korea, where we have access, but Canada does not. Interesting with South Korea is, we're seeing about 3.1% growth GDP over the next 10 years, but 10 times per capita income of China. So that's a very important market for the U.S. and why I think we've really targeted that for a lot of our trade missions. So USDA puts out 10-year projections, and these are a little bit dated. They're as of February 2014. So we'll get an update to these shortly here in the next few months. But I thought it was really just interesting to look at the major beef importers and the expectations for growth for imports in the next 10 years. So, this really backs up to a lot of my slides from previously, where Japan here, we're seeing that as more of a traditional market, but if we're pointing to population and GDP, not on a percentage basis, not that much growth in the next 10 years. But a market, again, not to forget about, because it's a very traditional, important market for the U.S. Also we look at some of these markets like Africa, we know very little about, but we can see potentially large growth. Mexico there, which would be helped out very much by our free trade agreements, allow us to get into some of those markets. When I typically do my outlook talks, we do talk about in the shorter term currency rates. And so looking at our major export customers, the strength of the U.S. dollar doesn't help that situation out all that much. And really we've seen relative to the U.S. currency, weakening in those currencies, less buying power, which, in the short term can impact some of those export markets from the quantity, the volume that they will be importing. A little bit on our competition as the U.S., as a major beef exporter. I always so Australia, they've taken some of the Japan market that we've once had, we're gaining that back. Here, Australia, really, not in the next 10 years, doesn't look to be much more of a large player in that market. Brazil here, I think would point to one of the larger and larger players. Argentina, one of the larger and larger players that we will compete with. Interesting with this is I'm part of an international benchmarking group, which we do get to look at our production costs. And the U.S. is very favorable in production costs, which really does allow us to, compete on this market, and especially if we can give products to our export customers that they're really desiring and their customers are demanding. That very much helps it out, situation where we have relatively lower production costs and can give them that added value that maybe some of the other exporters cannot do. And again, looking at our exporters from a shorter term basis, Brazil, while they've seen their currency weaken, which isn't helping them domestically, it's helping them very much on the export market and allowing for some growth here in the short term as far as beef exports. So just to summarize a bit, looking at our major beef exports, Japan, a large part of that volume and value pie, Mexico, Canada, and then we're seeing some of these other countries have really been increasing here. A lot of that is starting to be Latin America. We're seeing that become a larger and larger part of that value pie. And what's happened so far here in 2014? So I've just laid out exports and boxed beef prices. And the situation in 2014 has been very interesting, and it really shows kind of the economic theory behind it. So it's kind of made sense in the standpoint that exports, especially export demand, is very inelastic in the short term. And so there's some reasons for that. Well, it's because I'm very dependent on those exports, me importing those into my country, and so I'm not going to change that quantity all that much. Also, when we look at, we're expecting higher and higher prices for beef, right? And so our export customers are purchasing more at those lower prices, anticipating higher prices further on. And that's really what's really happened here in 2014. We're seeing increases on a year-over-year basis until July, really once we've started to see that boxed beef price increase. So when we look year to date, beef exports are still slightly up compared to a year ago. And remember, we're at a lot higher prices. So we've seen really a shift in demand from our export market. Our major players here have been, for the most part, Mexico. The last couple months here, we've seen them decline, but Mexico's still increased from a year-over-year standpoint rather large. We look at South Korea, Hong Kong there, and then some of these Philippines and some of these other countries here, Latin America, has really been pulling our exports up. USDA at this point is expecting slightly up from a year ago, but then declining here in 2015, and very much a price impacted export demand in 2015.